The easiest moral place to stand is in the middle. Standing in the middle is comforting. It grants you the illusion that you're being even-handed, that you see nuance and complexity where others just see black and white. It's flattering to be in the middle. No one hates your viewpoint enough to make you their opponent, and yet you get to stand apart from everyone, tut-tutting both sides. When it comes to Israel and its terror-supporting enemies, the West has, for some decades, taken precisely that middle position. Sure, Israel should be able to defend itself, but not too much. Yes, Israel has the right to exist, but it must make concessions to those who openly seek Israel's destruction. When Israel's enemies pursue the worst atrocities in 4 generations, it's difficult to maintain that position of studied neutrality, in which attacks on Israel are chalked up to political differences and shrugged away. It turns out that scenes of brutally massacred children, women, and men tend to upset the moral stomach. But then, the stomach settles again. All it takes to return to that sophisticated neutrality is a few false platitudes, a few comforting lies. 3 of those lies in particular have been provided in significant supply by the hard left and its allies in the legacy media. The first lie is that Israel must be warned not to engage in human rights violations. We hear this all the time from the President of the United States, from the United Nations, from the President of France, from the media. The idea is that if Israel's leadership isn't reminded in the wake of the worst pogrom since the Holocaust, those rude Jews might do something truly evil. They might carpet bomb Gaza. They might nuke the place. The purpose of the lie is really simple: to get Israel to stop defending itself at the first available opportunity. See, if you warn the world that Israel has to be warned not to pursue atrocities, and then, as inevitably happens in a war, something awful happens, Israel can be blamed, and they can quickly be shoved back into the box of moral equivalence. Voila, status quo ante restored. Of course, this lie is a lie, and it is a stupidly offensive lie in the same way that it is a lie when the United Nations warns the United States about human rights violations. Israel is a professional military. It abides by the rules of war. Its enemies openly cheer the death of civilians, both Israel's and their own. By all rights, the entire political and media infrastructure ought to be using their supposed moral suasion on human rights to convince Hamas to release hostages and protect, Gazan civilians. But of course, there's no interest in that. The lie must be maintained. Israel has to be warned about human rights because secretly, if it weren't for the intervention of the West, the Jews would just be like Hamas. That's lie number 1. Then there's the second lie, that we must all remember the vaunted peace process. Yes, the 2-state solution, the peace process that was obviously and clearly and openly stated a ruse undertaken by Yasser Arafat in order to provide the jumping off point for a genocidal war on the Jews. The peace process that has ended in the election of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, the leadership of the Palestinian Authority and Islamic Jihad in the West Bank. We must, the lie goes, remember the 2-state solution. It's just so important. Of course, this lie is dangerous too. It's dangerous because once again, it inevitably places the blame on Israel for murder of Jews in Israel. If only the Jews had made more concessions, other than, the partition plan of 1947 accepted by the Jews, rejected by the Arabs, or the Egyptian-Israeli peace deal of 1979. The Arab states boycotted Egypt after Anwar Sadat's peace with Israel for almost a decade. The Oslo Accords themselves, Ehud Barak's 2000 Camp David proposal rejected by Yasser Arafat, who then initiated a violent terror war resulting in the death of 1,184 Israelis. The Gaza withdrawal of 2005, Hamas was elected and has been launching terror attacks ever since. Ehud Olmert's 2008 peace plan rejected outright by Mahmoud Abbas without a counteroffer, and even Donald Trump's so-called deal of the century rejected before even being seen. But the lie goes, Israel must continue to make painful concessions. If they don't, Jew murder is inevitable. So when Jews get killed, it's actually the Jews' fault. Moral equivalence restored. Finally, there's the third and most comforting lie, that anti-Zionism, the wish for the destruction or non-presence of the state of Israel, has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. That lie is currently being encouraged by the equation of anti-Semitism with Islamophobia. This is happening all over the place. The anti-Semitism we see today on college campuses is part and parcel of the anti-Semitism that ended with the slaughter of 1,500 Jews in the Gaza envelope. Hatred of Jews is the driving force behind hatred of Israel. But in order to restore any semblance of moral cover for hating Israel, you have to separate anti-Semitism from anti-Zionism. This allows you to hate Jews while pretending to just hate Israel. The easiest way to accomplish this is to downplay the obvious reflection between international Jew hatred and attacks on Israel, and instead to subsume anti-Semitism under a broader, different rubric of lack of multicultural tolerance. Now, this is a lie, and it's an obvious lie. Of course, there are occasional acts of targeting of Muslims. And they are nothing like the targeting of Jews. These are not the same category. They do not follow the same logic. They're not the same perpetrators. They do not occur anywhere near as frequently. They are not spurred by the sort of cycle of violence in the Middle East talk that you keep hearing about. All of these comforting lies are useful in allowing the morally idiotic to attempt to regain a moral high ground via a falsely restored moral equivalence. and how eager they are for that moral equivalence, how badly they want it, how deeply they seek it. How many people are itching for some terrible thing to happen in the war so they can blame Israel and then go right back to Israel and its opponents. They're just the same. A site gets bombed by Israel that is a Hamas site, and some of the shrapnel hits the wall of a church and some people get killed, and it's Israel was targeting a church. People are looking for the off-ramp. This moral equivalence allows, for example, leftist Jews to pretend they won't be lumped in with their fellow Jews by the intersectional coalition. It allows the intersectional to pretend that they are on the side of the righteous, even as they make excuses for Hamas. It allows the international community to continue to pressure Israel after the biggest mass murder of Jews since, again, the Holocaust. Never again doesn't apply, after all, if the Jews, in the end, are part of the problem. And so, after approximately 1 week of global dyspepsia with the evil of Hamas, the world is gradually returning to its steady diet of moral equivalence. They're doing so with eagerness. This is why the New York Times was so excited to run with the false story of an Israeli airstrike on a hospital, believing a genocidal terror group from the jump. That story would have made their lives so much easier. Even in their retraction yesterday, they're still claiming the problem wasn't that they trusted Hamas, but that they just moved too fast. It was really not their fault, after all. Quote, the early versions of the coverage and the prominence it received in a headline, news alert, and social media channels relied too heavily on claims by Hamas and did not make clear that those claims could not immediately be verified. The report left readers with an incorrect impression about what was known and how credible the account was, says the New York Times. Of course, the real problem was trusting Hamas at all. But you can't trust Hamas, can you? The only reason to trust Hamas from the jump is because, again, you wish to restore that moral equivalence. Moral equivalence between a legitimate state that protects its citizens and a terror group that seeks the extermination of that other state's citizens and shields its own rockets with civilians. That ends with blood. It ends with blood. Calls for concessions to terrorist groups end with blood. Preventing military intervention to protect citizens of the West from terrorists ends with blood. Moral equivalence is a sin. Standing in the middle is not a sign of some sort of moral righteousness. It is a sign of weakness of mind and lack of moral backbone. Now, I would just like everyone to remember, after 9/11, it took a couple of years for the narrative to switch to the overarching evil of America and America's role in the Middle East. And maybe actually bin Laden was right. Maybe it was American imperialism that drove. It took a little while to get there. When it comes to the Jews, it takes like 5 seconds. So Jews get slaughtered, by the way, in overwhelmingly peacenik leftist areas of Israel. And one of the things that is so amazing about this is that Hamas could not be clearer, and its advocates could not be clearer in who they want to see die. And the answer is every Jew. The people in, for example, Kibbutz Be'eri, which is one of the places that was completely ravaged, like half the population is dead in Kibbutz Be'eri, in the last Israeli election cycle. These are not members of Likud. These are not right-wingers. About 3/4 of that kibbutz voted for the left-wing or far left-wing parties in the Israeli elections. It's the equivalent of terrorists attacking like the center of San Francisco. And yet the idea is, from all of the terror apologists, that the real reason this is happening is because of the intransigence of the Jews or whatever. When the real reason this is happening, of course, is because the Jews have this pesky insistence on not dying, on living, on breathing. There's a cartoon that's going around that's fairly accurate that shows a Hamas terrorist with a bomb strapped to his chest and a baby saying, I want to kill all the Jews. And then on the other side is Bibi Netanyahu. And in the center is the international community saying to Netanyahu, can you meet him halfway? And that's essentially the status quo ante that we are now reverting to. Okay, so I mentioned 3 big lies here. The first big lie is that Israel has to constantly be pressured to maintain human rights. When do you see this? Seriously, I'm wondering, when? Has there been one word to Ukraine, to Vladimir Zelensky, about preserving human rights? One word. Can you name one? I cannot. Has Joe Biden ever publicly said under any circumstances, Vladimir Zelensky, your country is under attack by the Russians, but we have to make sure that you really maintain human rights? Now, have Ukrainian forces violated human rights in certain occasions? Of course, because it's a war, and that's what happens. But you don't see Joe Biden out there every single day being like, well, that's those Ukrainians, you never know, they might go crazy. You don't see that, ever. Did you hear that with regard to even American troops in Iraq and Afghanistan? The answer, of course, is no. Did you hear about British troops or French troops who were involved in the coalition forces in these places? Of course not. The only place you ever hear this lie is with regard to Israel, as though Israel is equivalent with its opposition. So Israel, this allows the perverse logic by which you see morons on television or terror apologists masquerading as morons on television saying things like, well, Jews were killed in Kibbutz Be'eri and Kfar Aza, but also babies are being incinerated in Gaza. You mean for completely different reasons? Meaning, yes, it's horrible and awful when babies die in Gaza. And that is all the fault of Hamas, which launched the war and is keeping physically babies in places they should not be keeping the babies. I saw yesterday a clip of some dolt on British TV suggesting, for example, that, it's of no consequence when Israel warns civilians to get out before it hits a building. Of course, that's a catch-22. That's a catch-22 because if Israel didn't warn, then it would be an atrocity. But if Israel does warn, then it's still an atrocity. So in other words, when Israel takes precautions to save civilians, according to this idiot, this obviously is because Israel doesn't care about human rights. But if Israel didn't give the warning, then also Israel would not care about human rights. Big line number two is that Israel effectively, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. And that really, when we're talking about the rise in anti-Semitism that we're seeing all over the globe, when we see giant crowds in the streets in London chanting, "Free Palestine," which means murder all the Jews in the area, or when we see people in Sydney chanting "gas the Jews," they don't actually mean gas the Jews. They mean that Israel should be nicer. That's what they actually mean. That it's transmuted. And thus, anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, is not actually like in any way wanting the destruction of the state of Israel. See, here's the thing. If you admit that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, the calls for a two-state solution become untenable. The reason they become untenable is because everyone in the Palestinian Authority and Islamic Jihad hierarchy, everyone, and by the way, large swaths of the Palestinian population are anti-Zionist. When I say large swath, I mean nearly everyone is anti-Zionist. So if you admit that anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism, you're admitting that that population is anti-Semitic. And you can't make a deal with anti-Semites. So instead, there has to be this self-flattering Western bizarre view that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are two separate things. Again, that was completely exploded October 7th when a group of very left-wing, many of them peace activists in Israel were slaughtered wholesale by jihadis. That was destroyed, but they're going to go right back to status quo ante. So if anti-Semitism is not anti-Zionism, if these are two separable things, then what is anti-Semitism most like? Well, the best way to hide this is to pretend that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are two aspects of the same thing. They're just part of a broader rubric of a cycle of violence that when Muslims call for the destruction of, radical Muslims call for the destruction of the state of Israel, when they go into the streets of Sydney and chant "gas the Jews," that's just part of a cycle of violence in which Jews are doing the same thing to Muslims, and it's just a cycle of violence altogether. And it really has nothing to do with Israel per se. So we can put pressure on Israel, which just got absolutely destroyed in the South. We can just, so that's the goal here, right? Tie these together. And you're seeing the administration do this like all the time. And Norm Macdonald had a tweet from 2016 that started to go viral again. And it should go viral because it's really funny, in which he said, quote, "What terrifies me is if ISIS were to detonate a nuclear device and kill 50 million Americans, imagine the backlash against peaceful Muslims." And that is precisely the line that is now being taken by so many members of the media, so many members of this administration, so many members of the left. Is that, oh my God, the rise in Islamophobia that's going to be attendant on the murder of 1,500 Jews is just it's going to boggle the mind. The rise in anti-Semitism, the rise in Islamophobia that's going to be attendant on, seeing hundreds of thousands of people march in solidarity with terrorists. Wow, we can't allow that. And anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, they are both just from the same place. They're the same people. That's what's really happening. Okay, now it's not. It really, really is not. That doesn't mean there aren't people who aren't racist against Muslims or who see people with brown skin, don't like them. Okay, that is a very different thing from what we are seeing right now, which is the desire to full-scale exterminate the state of Israel because it's filled with Jews. If the state of Israel were not filled with Jews, they would not be interested in exterminating it, would they? In any case, here was Karine Jean-Pierre yesterday. She was asked about the rise in anti-Semitism in the United States, which, yeah, I mean, Jews don't feel comfortable on campus because many of them have been beaten up. Jews in Skokie are being confronted with mass protests in favor of Hamas. Every Jew I know personally, like literally every Jew I know personally, is obtaining a gun. Everyone. Because of the rise in anti-Semitism. But here's Karine Jean-Pierre's asked about anti-Semitism, and she immediately swivels into Islamophobia land. And so you have to ask, why? You have to ask yourself why. And the answer is, again, it's that desire to separate off anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism by instead lumping together anti-Semitism and Islamophobia under some sort of broad rubric of all discrimination is bad. Here is Karine Jean-Pierre, incompetent press secretary.
Level of concern right now about the potential rise of anti-Semitism in light of everything that's going on in Israel?
So a couple of things. We have not seen any credible threats. I know there's been always questions about credible threats. And so Just want to make sure that that's out there. But look, Muslim and those perceived to be Muslim have endured a disproportionate number of hate-fueled attacks. And certainly President Biden understands that many of our Muslim, Arab Americans and Palestinian American loved ones and neighbors are worried about the hate being directed at their communities. And that is something you heard the president speak to in his address just last Thursday.
Well, I mean, I heard the question being about anti-Semitism, and yet you immediately swiveled into Islamophobia. How weird. How strange. Why? Why? Because if you can swivel into Islamophobia from a question about anti-Semitism, this allows you to avoid the real-time, real-world implications of the fact that anti-Israel is anti-Semitic. That's what that is. Instead, you just misdirect. By the way, Karine Jean-Pierre, I mean, she pretty much said it openly yesterday in a follow-on question. She was asked about whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism on college campuses, and she's like,
I know John Kirby addressed the protests on college campuses, and I appreciate that the president respects First Amendment rights to protest. But does the president view anti-Israel protests and sentiment on college campuses as anti-Semitism?
So look, I'm not going to get into what's happening across the country and at different universities. Not going to get into the specifics. As the Admiral said, the First Amendment right? That's what something, peaceful protest is really part of our democracy, being able for folks to
these people are pathetic. I'm sorry. This is the most pathetic bullshit I've ever heard. When she says this kind of stuff, just cut her off. She's a moron. All right. And then there is big line number 3. So big line number 1 is that Israel has to be pressured, because if they're not pressured to maintain human rights, they're going to violate human rights. And of course, that is all a setup. That's a setup. It's like a setup and a punchline. The setup is Israel has to be pressured not to violate human rights. Then it's a war and something goes wrong. It's, well, we told them, but those Jews can't be controlled. So really what happens, this whole thing is just a big cycle of violence, moral equivalence. That's big line number 1. It's told by a huge number of people in the media and in government. Big line number 2 is, of course, that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, and that those two are separable. And so you can be just as anti-Israel as you want. You can even kind of be in favor of its extermination, and that's not anti-Semitic. What you really should be focused on is all sorts of discrimination like Islamophobia. That's really what we need to be talking about, is Islamophobia. That's the big problem, because where anti-Semitism comes from is the same place that anti-Islam activity comes from. They all come from the same place, and that is you being me. Not true. Not true at all. Many things can be bad and also not be alike. Okay, big line number 3. The two-state solution is the thing we have to be focused in on right now. That's insane. I'm sorry, that's totally insane. That is like saying, after 9/11, the thing that the United States has to be focused on right now is coming to a deal with the Taliban. That's crazy. It's nuts. No one would suggest such a thing. If you did suggest such a thing, people would laugh you out of a room. But that is now the adopted mode of literally everyone in Western politics. Well, we can't let this two-state solution die. We can't let it die. With whom do you propose to do this two-state solution? With whom? The biggest advocates of the two-state solution in Israel just got murdered. Their children were just burned to death alive. That's all, again, the communities around the Gaza envelope, those places are, by and large, members of the political left in Israel. It doesn't matter to these folks. It doesn't matter at all. So this is where you get Joe Biden's tweet again. Joe Biden talking about the two-state solution. As hard as it is, we cannot give up on peace. Who is we? Who is we? Like, what? Of course the United States would love to see peace over there. Duh. You know who else would like to see peace over there? Israel. You know who doesn't want to seek peace? The other side. Clearly. Again, very simple thought experiment. Tomorrow, if the IDF disbanded and no Jew had a gun, every Jew in that region is dead. Every single one. If they all gave up their guns tomorrow, they would all be dead. Meanwhile, if Hamas had disarmed, if Hamas were not a terror group, you know what would have happened? Success. You know what would have happened in the Palestinian Authority areas? Were they not siphoning money off to their personal bank accounts? Mahmoud Abbas is worth now tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. You know what would have been happening if they had not been building up terror groups and indoctrinating their kids to hate Jews as a tool against the Jewish state? You know what would have been happening? Prosperity. The math here is very simple. And yet, again, it's this idea that we all want the same thing. We don't. I'm sorry to break it to you. We don't. Not everyone on the earth wants the same things as you. And it is ethnocentricity of the highest possible level to believe they do. When people tell you what they want and then you ignore them and say, no, what you really want is peace. What you really want is a better economic way of life. What you are being, you want to talk about paternalism? That's paternalism. When Joe Biden says we cannot give up on a two-state solution, Israelis and Palestinians equally deserve to live in safety, dignity, and peace. They may equally deserve to live in safety, dignity, and peace, but only one side is seeking to live in safety, dignity, and peace. You think Israelis are fond of having to draft their 18-year-old kids and then put them at checkpoints? Do you think that's something they love to do? Would you love to do that with your kids? The answer, of course, is no. And yet that's what Israel has to do. Why? Because if they don't, they will be overrun and murdered in their beds, as we saw. But this is the lie, and they're going to keep pushing this lie.